This is going to be a sort of an overview of some things that you might look for when you start to think about evaluating a horse. And I think it's really important that before you really do conformation evaluation, that you understand a little bit about what is important for either the discipline that you are interested in or the breed that you're interested in, because that really is the most important factor. So if good movement is the most important thing, and you can define what that good movement is, that's a good place to start. Or if breed character is really important, or if muscling is really important, you need to know what those things are. And so I think that that's always a good place to start. But there are some things that sort of apply across all types of horses. And so those were some things that I wanted to talk about tonight. I usually tell my undergraduate students that when they look at a horse and they look at them on the outside, they really need to use their X-ray vision and go beyond the outside and think about what's underneath. And in particular, what are the pieces of the skeleton? Because the pieces of the skeleton are going to be the things that really govern the horse's structure. And so it's important that when you look at the horse, don't just look at the exterior part, but think about what lies underneath their skin and their muscles that basically provides the scaffold that really represents what the horse's structure is going to be. So we're going to talk about two parts tonight. We're not going to talk about muscling. We're not going to talk about quality. We're not going to talk about breed character. We're going to talk about structure, and then we're going to talk about balance and some of the concepts that are associated with those factors. So when I talk about structure, I'm thinking about angles and lengths. And so again, we have the horse on the outside, but look deeper and think about how this shape that the horse shows us is going to be dictated by the structures that are underneath. And so if you think about this part of the horse and we think about the scapula or the shoulder blade, and then the humerus, and then we have the radius, and how all of those bones fit together. There are lengths that are related, and then there are angles between where the bones come together. And both the lengths and the angles are really important because they affect the horse's stride and performance characteristics. And they also affect how forces are distributed when the horse is landing or when they're pushing. So if you think about the horse driving off his hindquarters, structure is going to be important for that. And so we know that we want different kinds of stride and performance characteristics. So we don't expect a dressage horse to move the same way as a saddlebred or the same way as a Western pleasure horse or as a hunter. So as I said, you need to know what those positive characteristics are for whatever your discipline is, and then think about the conformation characteristics that apply to those. So we're going to talk about each one of these, a little bit on stride and performance characteristics, and then a little bit on distribution or dissipation of forces. And feel free to interrupt me any old time. So probably everyone in this Zoom meeting has seen a diagram somewhere that shows the front view of the horse and the back view of the horse, and it has diagrams of the limbs. And it will say something like, when looking at the horse from the front, you should be able to draw a line from the point of the shoulder down through the center of the forearm, the center of the knee, the center of the cannon, center of the pastern, and down through the center of the foot. And that if you look at the front legs, they should be basically parallel to each other, and that the feet are essentially as far apart as the knees and as far apart as the shoulders. Likewise, when you look at the horse from the rear, you want to be able to see conformation that where you can draw a line from basically the point of the buttocks down through the horse's stifle, down through the point of the hock, down through the back of the cannon, and come out basically at the heel. Now, by and large, most horses are going to toe out a little bit behind just because their hindquarters are pretty wide. But in general, we look for this type of alignment. And one of the reasons that we do that is because it affects the dissipation of forces when the horse lands. So when the horse moves straight forward, they are going to land evenly on both sides of the foot, and any of those landing forces are going to be distributed evenly through the center of the horse's limb. So neither the inside nor the outside will bear more weight. Likewise, if the horse has a straight limb, the forces will move evenly up the cannon bone, be distributed equally through the knee, and then up through the forearm and into the shoulder. So that would be, this horse is really pretty correct. They have good even force distribution up the column of bone. And that's one of the characteristics when you think about a horse that's 1,200 pounds that can run at 40 miles an hour, and they're being supported on this limb here. One of the things that contributes to the ability of them to be able to bear those huge forces is the fact that they have this straight column of bone that allows even force distribution. Now, what about the horse down here? This horse is not going to have even force distribution. So which side of his foot is he going to land on first? You can have audience participation.
If you guys want to unmute, then you can do that to express the answer.
The outside or the right side?
Absolutely. So you can see that when he lands, he's going to land first on the outside, and then he's going to roll over and hit the inside. So this horse is going to be distributing more forces here on the outside of his limb. And if this horse, if we didn't take care of his feet over time, you would find that eventually he's going to wear off and and have more wear and tear on the outside of his hoof, because that's where he lands. Now, very few horses are perfect, and very few people are perfect. So if you guys were to look down at the heel of your shoe, I bet you would find that some of you are wearing the outside of your shoe, some of you wear the inside of your shoe. And so horses are the same way. And so that's one of the reasons why we have to think about their feet and make sure that we're not allowing them to wear one side way different than the other. But you can see that he's going to have force distribution that's not going to be the same on both sides. Okay. We also want to think about the horse not just from the front, but also from the side in terms of force distribution. So the horse has several angles in his forearm that we think about, and several angles in his hind leg that we think about. And those are not going to affect just force distribution, but they're also going to affect the horse's ability to move. So as we look at this horse, depending upon what we wanted him to do, we might be able to forecast whether or not he would be good at whatever that discipline is. So one of the first structures that we're going to look at is going to be the horse's shoulder. And so the bone that's underneath here is the scapula, okay, or the shoulder blade. And when we think of the horse's shoulder and we think of the length, we're thinking about the length from the top of the scapula to the end of the scapula where it connects to the humerus, which would be right in here. Okay, so we're thinking about that. And then we also think about the slope or the angle of the shoulder. And so there are some terms that are used to describe that, and I think sometimes they are perhaps confusing, but I wanted to talk about those a little bit. So when we think about the angle of the slope of the horse's shoulder, we're thinking about the angle that's here between the slope of the shoulder or the slope of the scapula and then a horizontal line. And you can read conformation textbooks and they will tell you that the horse should have a 45-degree angle here between the angle of the scapula and the angle of the horizontal line. Not a lot of horses have that. Probably most horses are closer to, say, 50 degrees. But that angle does influence a bunch of things. It's going to influence how the horse moves, and it's also going to influence the position of the horse's neck. So some terms that people use. So if this yellow line sort of represented this horse's slope, right? And so we're going to sort of identify that from the top of the scapula to where it articulates in the point of the shoulder. If that line moves this way towards the pink side, we call that a more upright shoulder, or a steeper shoulder, or a straighter shoulder. Okay, so I think of it this way. I think about downhill skiing. So a steeper hill you go faster on because it's more upright. Okay, so here we have a more upright shoulder, a straighter shoulder, or a steeper shoulder. So that would be the term that would represent if his scapula was positioned here, okay, with the top of the scapula here and then the point of the shoulder here. On the other side is a shoulder that is more sloping. Okay, so this would be the blue line, and this would be if the scapula was laid back a little bit further here. So if the top of the scapula was here and the point of the shoulder is here, this becomes a more sloping shoulder, or a more sloped shoulder. So sometimes people say, well, if it's more sloping, it should be more steep, but that's not the way the terminology goes. The terminology says this more gradual hill, where if you're skiing down it, you're going to go slower, a more gradual slope. That would be considered a more sloping shoulder. And in some cases, people will refer to that as a more laid back, meaning the top of the shoulder is laid back further on the horse's back. So who cares, and why does that matter? Well, if you think about where these lines point to on the ground, and so if you followed this pink line down here, or you followed the yellow line, it might come out here, or the blue line might come out here. That starts to give us some indication of how far ahead the horse's front limb can actually reach. So one of the things that you should recognize about many horses is that the front limb in many cases sort of acts like a pendulum that swings back and forth. Okay, so if we are looking for a long stride, we want to be able to see that pendulum swing out far. So why is the shoulder important? So here is a saddlebred that has a very sloping shoulder. So here's the top of the scapula, here's the point of his shoulder. So this is a very sloping shoulder. And that's important because this horse, when he does his job, is going to have to be able to reach out with his shoulder and be able to get his front limb out here in front of him. Okay, so he needs to be able to lift that limb easily up high. The other thing that happens here is this nice sloping shoulder allows the neck to come up out of the horse's shoulder. And so this nice sloping shoulder, it positions the neck to come way up here. It's not just for saddlebreds. Here's a horse that's going over a fence, okay? And you can see that as he has brought his front limbs forward, his shoulder has come up here. His shoulder is almost parallel to the ground at this point in time. And so having a sloping shoulder is also important for these horses to be able to lift their front limbs up high over a fence, okay? Now, this horse's neck is not going to come out as high as the saddlebred's, but it's still going to come out with an arch. So that's going to be important too. So the shoulder is important because it affects how the front limb moves, but it also affects the position of the neck. So the standard thing is that people would say, so a more sloping shoulder is always better. Not really. It's good for these horses, but it doesn't necessarily mean that every horse needs to have a shoulder that looks like this, nor does every horse need to have a neck that looks like this. If you're a Western pleasure type of person, you want your horse to have a level top line. So if he has a neck that comes out like this, that's not going to be helpful for you in trying to train that horse. So in Western pleasure horses, if they have a little bit straighter shoulder and their neck comes out more level, that is going to naturally make them move in this more level type of frame, right? And they're never going to have to move their legs out and up the way that a saddlebred or a jumper or a dressage horse would do. And so having the straighter shoulder with a little bit less reach is not a problem. And so the shoulder is important because it really governs what the horse is going to do with his front limbs. And there's no one best conformation. There's only conformation that's good for whatever discipline you plan to use the horse for. Okay, does anybody have any questions? Okay, I'm going to move on.
I don't have a question, but I do have a comment. You see, in the beginning, when I was introducing Dr. Lawrence, I used the wrong terminology. I said the steeper shoulder was more slopey shoulder. You see, they both start with an S, but you need to correct me when you guys see me doing something wrong. Okay, there we go.
I don't know what the right, better words would be, but I know that my students are often confused by those because they seem to be the same terms, but it's what people use. So the other part about the foreleg, when we look at it from the side, we're going to talk about the forearm. So that would be this length here, basically from the elbow joint down to the knee. So that is going to be the forearm. Then we're going to talk about the cannon, which would be this area here, and then the angulation between the fetlock and the pastern, or the pastern. Okay, so, and again, we're going to think about both length, and angles for the purposes of our discussion today. So when we think about the cannon, most people would agree that a shorter cannon is a stronger cannon. The cannon bone is the third metacarpal. It is an important bone because it absorbs a lot of concussion in the horse when they run at speed or jump over big jumps. And so if it is shorter, it means it doesn't have as much ability to bend. And so that is going to make it stronger. On the other hand, if you have a long forearm and a short cannon, that means that the horse will be able to have a lower foot flight. So when they move their foot forward, their foot will not reach as far off the ground because they don't have to bend their knee as much to move their foot. So does that make sense? So in some disciplines, like in Western pleasure and in hunters, it's important that the horse moves with what we call a flat knee, that they don't have a lot of knee action. And so for those horses, we want to look to see this relationship between the long forearm and the shorter cannon, because that means that the horse can move the limb forward without bending the knee very much. And that's the type of movement that's desirable for those types of athletes. Now, for instance, for dressage horses or for some types of Arabians and some types of Morgans and for saddlebreds, that relationship becomes less important because those horses can have more knee action. Of course, those horses don't really do things where they're putting tremendous force on their cannon. And so if they have a little bit longer cannon, that's not typically an issue. The other thing to think about is that when we look at the front limb from the side, we need to realize that the pastern and the fetlock are important shock absorbers. And so not just the tendons and the ligaments that are in the back of the limb, but when the horse lands, you can see that how the fetlock here is sinking down and the pastern becomes almost parallel to the ground. And so as the horse is placing weight on this limb, the fetlock and pastern are acting as a shock absorber. So if the horse has a very short and upright pastern, like this horse does, that is going to mean that this horse is going to have a great deal of reduced capacity to absorb shock. So this pastern and fetlock are not going to be able to go down as far and therefore not be able to absorb as much concussion. Now, is that a problem? Well, if you have a Western pleasure horse who mostly goes at slow speeds, he might have a little bit harder type of ride. It might not be as comfortable for you, but it's probably not a huge issue in terms of, you know, the total shock absorbing that he needs to absorb. On the other hand, if you're thinking about a horse that's jumping over a big fence or a horse that's running at high speed, having this very short and upright pastern and no shock absorption is a problem. Because what happens is that concussion that was supposed to be absorbed here moves up the horse's limb, and it can increase now the forces that are distributed in the knee or further up. Okay, so that shock absorber is pretty darn important. The other thing to think about when you sort of look at the front limb of the horse and think about structure and shock absorption is, what does the horse do? So is it a high impact type of sport? And then the other thing is, are there other characteristics of the horse's body that either could compensate or could contribute? And so this particular horse I refer to as Dino Horse, because to me he looks like a dinosaur that has a giant long neck here. He's got a big shoulder, and so he has a lot of weight here in his front part of his body. And so he's a heavy horse. He's got a lot of muscling, right? And he doesn't have very good shock absorption. If he was a lighter framed horse with a little bit different balance, it might be something that he could compensate for. Okay, so again, you want to start to think about sort of some of the things that go together. Are there things that are contributing factors to a problem, or are there factors that could actually contribute and be compensatory?
Dr. Lawrence, before you go on, go back to that picture. I've always heard that if they're short and steep in their pastern, they're steep in their shoulder. I mean, does that go hand in hand?
In many cases it does. In some cases it doesn't, but those are good things to look for. Certainly if you looked at, this horse doesn't have a bad shoulder. It's not a real sloping shoulder, but his pasterns are actually a little bit more upright than his shoulder, and you can especially see that in this leg that's on the other side. But a lot of times they do go together. So that's a little bit on the forehand. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the hindquarter. And it's important to realize that, with the exception of draft horses that use their shoulders and their front limbs to pull, the vast majority of our equine athletes use their hind limbs as their power source. And so the hindquarter is the source of power. So the hindquarter is pretty important. We could think of it as the motor. And so the size of the motor, just like in a sports car, is going to be pretty important. And so one of the characteristics that we will think about is the length of the hip. And most people would think about that being associated with perhaps the length of the horse's pelvis, but from the point of the hip up here back to the point of the buttocks. So they're going to think about the length of the horse's hip, because that provides attachment area for the major muscles that are going to be the power source. And so if you have a little short pelvis with not a lot of attachment space, you're not going to have as much power in general back here as you would if you had a larger pelvis with more attachment and more muscle. So the length of the horse's hip is really important. But the other thing to look for is to look for the angle of the hip. Okay, and so this is the hip joint here. It's between the pelvis and then the bone that's in here. And so does anybody know what this bone is?
Is that the stifle?
The joint down here is the stifle. This bone would be the thigh bone. Yeah. The bone is the femur, okay, which is also referred to as the thigh bone. The thigh bone connects to the hip bone. Okay, this would be the femur, which is the largest long bone in the horse's body. Okay, so this angle between the horse's pelvis and the femur is important because it governs where the hind limb is going to sit underneath the horse. Okay, so in this particular horse, the hind limb sits directly underneath the hind quarter. But if I moved this femur line and put it back here, it would set the hind limb of the horse back behind the horse. Okay, so not only looking at the length of the horse's hip and the power that you have associated with that, but looking at the position of the femur will help you understand where this limb is going to be positioned underneath the horse. So why is that important? Well, for many of our sports, we want the horse to be able to bring its hind quarter underneath and step underneath the horse to be able to elevate the front limb. Okay, so a horse that has his hind limb set underneath him is going to be able to do that more easily than a horse that has his hind limb set out behind him. Okay, so this is an example of a dressage horse that is doing piaffe or trot in place, where the hindquarters have come up underneath the horse and are stepping way under. But we want to see the same thing in our reining horses. They have to be able to step up underneath themselves as well. And likewise, a horse that's going to be jumping needs to bring his hindquarters up underneath him to be able to lift his front limbs. So this position of the hind limb is really important. Even in Western pleasure horses, they have to be able to elevate the forelimb so that the horse can move lightly. So some conformation defects that are associated with position of the hind limb, one of those is considered a sickle hawk. And so in this horse, if we were to draw a line down from the back of the buttocks down, it might almost touch the point of the hock, but then you can see that the rest of the limb is positioned up underneath. Now, some people think that this is an advantage because it allows the horse to step up a little further, but it does put more stress on the hock. On the other hand, this limb conformation, this horse has a big long hip, but if we think about where the limb is positioned, here's the stifle, here's where the hip goes. This horse has a very open angle through its hip, and so in this case, the limb is positioned further back underneath the horse, and it also has a very straight hock. And so people would refer to this horse as a post-legged horse. And in general, a horse that has a post-legged conformation like this does not tend to bring the limb up underneath them as far. And they are, when they push, they have less angulation here. And so they tend to put less stress or put more stress on the hock and have more hock problems. So both this conformation and this conformation can affect the soundness of the horse, but this horse is probably going to be able to step under more easily than this horse would.
Wouldn't you think that the post leg is a worse fault than the sickle hawk?
It would be for certainly for conformations where you need the horse to step up underneath.
Like Tennessee walking horses.
Yeah, absolutely. So that walking horses have to do that. Lots of horses have to do that. Some people think that this conformation actually could contribute to speed because it allows basically a shorter but more rapid stride. So if you're looking for something where they're, for instance, quarter horses that are coming out of the gate and doing short distance racing, this conformation may not be that much of a detriment. So it really depends upon what you're looking for.
I have a question regarding judging.
Yep.
Looking back at the pictures of those two previous horses, if we were judging something like a halter class, to where we're just looking kind of at the aesthetic qualities of the horse, I know that some of the horses in like halter classes were bred more along the post-legged kind of lines so that the legs were a little bit straighter. Would that be a scenario where that post-legged horse, even though in a like movement situation, it's less desirable than sickle hawked, could it be placed over a sickle hawked horse in a halter scenario?
Yeah, so as I said at the outset, that judging and evaluating are kind of two different things. So you need to know what the what the breed standard is and what the breed standard considers to be acceptable and not acceptable. And you're absolutely right that one of the things that's happened here, that in order for this horse to have this huge amount of muscle here, right, this particular conformation has sort of evolved. And so you'll see that this horse, obviously in quarter horses, you know, muscling is going to be a pretty big determinant. And so this horse has a huge amount of muscle here in his hind quarter. And so the fact that he's a little bit post-legged, that is going to outweigh this horse's conformation over here. And this horse doesn't have nearly the same amount of muscle that ties down in. And so you're going to have to take all of those things into account. So if the horse had this amount of muscling and had a normally conformed hock and stifle, that would be preferable. But probably a lot of the horses that you see in a halter class for quarter horses, paint horses, those type of horses, it would not be uncommon for them to be a little bit straight in their stifle, and people don't necessarily hate that. So again, part of it is to know what the breed standard is and what the breed itself thinks about as a forgivable conformation defect versus not. So those are good questions, and that's the, you know, that's sort of the world that we live in right now. So let's go back to this concept of front and rear limb structure and the front and rear views. And so here again, we have the lines that come down through the shoulder and the forearm and the knee and the foot in both the front and the back. And the whole idea here is that these landing and pushing forces are going to be distributed equally through the whole leg, so that when the horse pushes with the hind leg, there's not going to be any twisting or turning. And when the horse lands, the forces will be distributed up evenly. And the other thing that happens is that this conformation allows the horse's limb to swing straight forward and back. So there's not going to be any wasted motion, and there's not going to be opportunity for one leg to hit another leg. So we distribute the forces equally, and it allows the limb to swing straight forward and straight back. So these are two common conformation defects. The first one is a horse that is base narrow, where the feet are closer together than the shoulders. And so if we were to think about the lines of force in the base narrow horse, the forces are going to be exerted more on the outside of the limb because the limbs are moved inside. And so more forces on the outside of the limb, right? And if we have a horse that is base wide, where the feet are wider apart than the shoulders, now there's going to be more forces on the inside. Okay. So now we're stressing structures differently. We're going to, here on the inside, we're stressing tendons, or stressing ligaments that move here. In the knee, we're stressing the bones that are on the inside of the knee more than the bones that are on the outside. We're putting in some twisting forces. And so we're not distributing our forces evenly, and that puts other parts of the limb, some parts of the limb, under more forces than others. If the horse is not doing very much hard work, probably is not a big deal. If they are going to be a racehorse or a 3-day eventing horse, that becomes a much bigger deal because they're putting way more forces on their limbs. The other thing is that horses that have structural defects from the front or from the rear will oftentimes not move in a straight line. And so horses that are toed in, where the toes are pointing to the inside, will often paddle out, so the limb will swing to the outside. Okay, so that may seem a little bit strange, but horses that toe in, and if they are also base narrow, they will oftentimes paddle to the outside. Now, I can tell you that with standard bred horses that are used as pacers, where the two limbs on the same side move together, this is not generally considered a huge defect because the limbs move to the outside. On the other hand, if you had pacers that were toed out, like this horse is, where the feet are pointing to the outside, these horses tend to wing in. And for pacers, that's considered a huge defect because the horse has an opportunity to hit the other limb. And that's generally true for many types of horses. So if they wing in, they may be more inclined to interfere. If they are toed out and base narrow and the feet are close together, that makes that even more possible, right? So the limbs are not swinging straight, and so the horses are losing some efficiency of movement, and you have some potential for the horses to interfere. Interference becomes more likely as the horse becomes fatigued. And so if you have a horse that is going to be competing in some type of activity where they're likely to get tired, then and they start to lose some of their coordination, then the potential to interfere is even more. So the defects in structure can affect the quality of movement, they can affect the length of stride, they can affect the power that the horse has, and they can affect how straight the limb actually moves. They also can affect the distribution of forces within the leg, and that can increase concussion or strain, and it can increase susceptibility to certain lamenesses. Now, in my opinion, probably one of the most important things is to actually watch the horse move. So if the horse has a conformation defect, but they are a beautiful mover, that is way more important to me than if they have perfect conformation and they're a terrible mover. So in the end, movement is always one of the things that we start to think about. How the horse carries itself becomes really important. Okay, so I'm going to pick up the pace here. So are you guys still with me? Have you fallen asleep? Are you okay? Okay.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. All right. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was what we often refer to as balance. And I think of conformational balance as being static balance because we observe it when the horse is standing still. And the reason that we look at static balance is because it relates to proportionality, and or when we look at static balance, it oftentimes relates to proportionality and symmetry. So basically what we see about the horse in terms of its proportions. As I said, the most important thing is actually how the horse moves. And so we look at athletic or dynamic balance when the horse is moving. And that's important. We look at things like regularity of movement and the distribution of the horse's weight. But the reason that we look at static balance is that it can affect dynamic balance. And so looking at the horse standing still can oftentimes give us some hints about how the horse is going to move. So the balance and the appearance that we look for is going to differ by the use of the horse. And so the type of balance that we look for in a hunter or a dressage horse is different compared to an Arabian endurance horse compared to a horse that's used for draft purposes. But there are some general concepts that kind of apply to all. And as you start to look for a particular discipline, you can start to recognize what kind of balance maybe fits that discipline the best. So how do we evaluate static balance? Sometimes people will tell me that they don't know what it is that they like or dislike about a horse, they just can see it. And I think that's great. But for those of us who need more information than that, I'm going to give you a few tools to be able to evaluate static balance in a horse. So this is my first tool. When I'm looking at a mature horse, I'm going to think about the length or the depth through his body relative to the length of his leg. Okay, and in this horse, he is pretty equally distributed between the length through his body and the length through his leg. So if you think about, for instance, a greyhound and what they look like, or you think about a dachshund and you think about what they look like, well, which horse is going to, or which dog is going to be able to run faster? Not the dachshund, right? It's going to be the greyhound because they have longer limbs relative to their body. So as you start to think about what you want your horse to do, you need to start thinking about this. Now, on the other hand, if I was selecting a horse that I was going to be using for, say, roping, I would probably want him to have a little bit shorter leg because he's going to be set closer to the ground and have a lower center of gravity to be able to stop the cow, right? So this is going to be the first thing I'm going to look at, is this sort of relationship to the depth of his body and the length of his leg relative to whatever the discipline is that I want him to do. The next thing I'm going to look at is going to be the length of the horse's torso relative to the horse's height. And does the horse basically fit into a square, or are they a long rectangle, or are they a big tall rectangle? Horses are animals that are really tall, especially if they're tall and have long legs and have a real short back. They have the potential for their hind legs to interfere with their front legs. So generally, we're looking for a horse that kind of fits into this type of square. The next thing I'm going to look at is this relationship between the horse's back, from basically the top of his withers to the top of his croup, and then the length of his underline from the front of his chest to the back of his stifle. And we're looking for something that's a short back or a long underline, with a long underline. And this happens when you have a good angle through the hip and a good angle through the shoulder. So if you look at a horse and you think, wow, looks to me like his back is almost as long as his underline, you need to look at that as a hint to be able to look here at the slope of the shoulder and the slope of the hip. Okay. Horses with this type of conformation typically have more power, and they tend to have a longer stride. The next one is the thing that I call the rule of thirds. And there's lots of different ways to look at this, but I draw a line through the front of the shoulder and then along where the back of the scapula is. So I consider this to be basically the front third. And then another line here at the point of the horse's hip, and another line here at the point of his buttocks. And are these three pieces about the same? Keep in mind that this is the motor, right? And then keep in mind that this is the whole front end, and then this is the middle piece. So in the rule of thirds, I would look at these and think about, are they approximately the same, or is one of the thirds much bigger than another, or is one of the thirds much smaller than the others? And what could that mean in terms of the ability of the horse to perform? Okay, so we could think about a horse with a small shoulder or a long mid-piece or a long hip, and how that might affect them in terms of their power or in terms of their stride length or some things like that. So one of the things that we look at when we looked at those two last pictures was the length of the back that is defined by either the middle third or by the trapezoid that we saw earlier. And so why is the back important when we look at horse conformation? Well, it's because the front part of the horse is going to be lifted by the back, or lifted by the back part of the horse, the hindquarters, but the horse's back is actually the connector. It is the suspension bridge. So between the power, right, and the part that has to be lifted, we have the back, which is the suspension bridge. So when we look at the skeleton of the horse, we can see that we've got vertebrae, right? So we've got the thoracic vertebrae the ribs are attached to, and then we have the lumbar vertebrae that are in here. And the only thing that is supporting the horse in this section are going to be these lumbar vertebrae and then the muscling that is in here. And so we referred to this part of the horse's back where the muscling is as the horse's loin. And then we also refer to this distance between the last rib and the point of the hip as the coupling. So for you guys, if you put your hand on your last rib and then your hip, some of you have a really short waist. Some of you have a really long waist. I am one of those people that has really short waist, right? So having a really short coupling in here is typically much stronger, right? Having more muscling here is going to be much stronger, so that when the horse has to use his hindquarter to lift the forequarter, that's going to be easier for him. The disadvantage might be that a really short coupling could maybe decrease the horse's flexibility a little bit. So if you're asking the horse to do things where you want him to do a lot of bending, that might be a little bit of a problem. Oh, sorry. Now I'm going to do, let me see. I'm going to stop the share, and I want you guys to watch me. So hopefully you can do that. So this is my, I brought, can you guys, okay. Can you guys see this? Yes, okay. So I brought Pokey today to help us. Okay, so this is my demonstration. So this thing here is a metal can that's filled with pennies. So it weighs a couple pounds. But I wanted it to represent basically Pokey's front end. And then I brought this metal ruler, and I've attached it to Pokey's front end. So this is going to represent Pokey's back. And then my hand is going to represent Pokey's hind quarter. Okay, so when I lift, when Pokey's back is short like this, and I lift up, Pokey's back doesn't bend very much, and it's relatively easy for me to do that with just one hand. Now, if I make Pokey's back longer, and so my hindquarters are further away, what you can start to see is that Pokey's back is really bending a lot more, right? So now when Pokey has to lift his front end, that puts a lot more strain on his back, and his hindquarters are going to have to work a lot harder. And then if I make it really long, you can see what happens. Now I actually need two hands basically to be able to do this. So it makes it a lot more work for my hindquarters, and look what's happened to Pokey's back. Now it's under a lot of stress. Okay, so that's my long back, short back demonstration.
Good analogy. Good job, Dr. Lawrence.
Yeah. Yes, audience, it always makes it more visual for folks when they can see that. So, okay, here. Okay, so that concept of that back in there is really pretty important. And you can imagine if the coupling is long and it's not very well muscled, how difficult it's going to be now for that horse to use his hindquarters to lift his front end. Especially if his hindquarters are little and his front end is big. Okay. All right. The last little part of this is to talk about the balance of the horse from the top of his croup. What's going on here? Ooh, from the top of his croup to the top of his withers. And so this particular horse has what we would sort of think of as level balance. There are some horses that are built uphill. So that's weird. So their withers are actually higher than their croup. And there are some horses that are built downhill where their withers are lower than their croup. Okay. And what does that do? Well, if their withers are higher than their croup, that can help redistribute their weight towards the back. And what would happen if their withers are lower than their croup? Where does their weight go?
On their front end more.
On their front end more, right? And so we're now talking about some things that can overall start to affect how the horse moves. So why is static balance important? Well, because it can affect dynamic balance. And so here we have a horse that is either level or slightly below level. They are a horse that has a not particularly well-developed hindquarter. They have a relatively thick neck. They have a big shoulder, right? And when you watch this horse move, they hit the ground hard because their weight is distributed forward. And so things that we want to do with this horse, like use it as a jumper, or use it as a hunter, or use it for dressage, or even using it as a Western pleasure horse, where we expect the horse to move light and be able to lift its forehand so it doesn't have to flex its knees very much. You can see that this horse has to bend its knee a lot in order to move its limb. And so that static balance that we can look at can really help us predict how this horse is going to move. So this horse's balance is going to make it difficult to do a lot of the things that we would perhaps want them to do. It doesn't mean that they're not going to be a good riding horse. It just means that they might not be able to achieve a high level of performance in some disciplines. On the other hand, here we have a horse that's built uphill, right? He's got a sloping shoulder and his neck comes out a little bit high. When he moves with a much flatter knee, and he has a longer stride and he moves lighter on the ground. And so when this horse hits the ground, it's not going to be as jarring and not as much concussion on the front limb as when this horse hits the ground. So when we look now at static balance, we're going to be looking to see whether or not the balance is going to facilitate the horse moving in a light way, being able to lift up its forehand, being able to engage its hind end, being able to connect between the front end and the back end. So those are all things that we think about in terms of static balance. So here, sometimes people say to me, I just can't judge horses. And I think everybody can judge horses if you just think about it in terms of some of the things that we've thought about. So if we look at this horse, if we start with structure, what do you think about her shoulder? Sloping or upright?
Upright.
Upright, yes, right? So here's the top of her scapula in here somewhere. Here's the point of her shoulder. It's pretty upright, okay? What has happened to her neck? Because her shoulder is upright, her neck is going to come out level. It's actually a little bit of a U neck, and it comes out really deep on her chest, right? Let's look at her hind quarter. What do we think about the length of her hip?
Short
Long
and steep.
Short? Yeah, short and steep, right? And she's a little bit maybe sickle hawked here in her hock. So she doesn't have a strong hind end. She doesn't have a strong front end, right? So a couple of things, when we look at the angle of her shoulder, here you can see that her front limb is back underneath her. She has the short, steep hip. Probably don't really like those hocks very well. So her structure is not very good. What about her balance?
It's not equal thirds.
Definitely not equal thirds, right? And she's a little bit taller than she is long, okay? But here is the big thing, right? So she's long in her middle, she's got a short shoulder, she's got a short hip, so she's not gonna have much power, she's not gonna have a very long stride, and she's got a really long connection in here. And one of the things that will happen with this horse, because her shoulder is steep, she's not gonna reach very far ahead, because her neck is set on really low. This mare is not going to be a light mover. She's not going to be a pretty mover. She's probably going to have a lot of knee action to be able to lift her leg forward. And so this is just not, you just look at her static balance and you just go, I know she's not going to be a good mover just based on what I see here. She also has a relatively short underline relative to her back, and that's because her shoulder is steep and her hip is steep. So she's not going to have that reach that we were looking for. She's not going to have that extension or power. So this horse was much more balanced. He's going to have a longer stride. He's going to be able to reach further. He's going to have more power from behind, and he's going to have much more balanced movement. So he's going to hit the ground lighter. He's not going to carry as much weight on his forehand. This mare is going to have a shorter stride. She's going to have much less power, and she's going to have a heavy forehand movement. So those are just some things that as you start to look at horses, you can start to think, well, not just how they would place in your conformation class, but how they're actually going to perform as far as being an athlete. And Fernanda said I should talk for an hour. And so I've talked for an hour. So with that, I'll take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Lawrence. Does anybody have any questions for Dr. Lawrence?
I think that was an awesome presentation, Dr. Lawrence. It just reinforced a lot of things that I already knew, but wasn't sure how it all went together. Like I knew all that stuff, but I didn't know the why sometimes behind it. And that really put the why behind a lot of things that I learned as a child, as a 4-H member.
Yeah, I think the big thing is that whatever discipline you're in, you need to know what the important characteristics are that contribute to that discipline. Because if you judge a saddlebred the way you would judge a quarter horse, you know, you're not going to make the right decision. So you really need to think about those sorts of things. And especially when you're going out to buy a horse, and especially if it's a young horse and you're trying to sort of project into the future, you know, what are some things that you can look for? So some of those things change with time, but a lot of them, you know, if they have a steep shoulder, they're probably going to have a steep shoulder. Some of those things won't really change very much.
So kids, in our horse judging manual, I'm assuming it's probably been a few years since I've looked. I'm not sure which horse judging manual we have out, Dr. Camargo, but in the horse judging manual, there is breed characteristics for the different breeds. And a lot of times you think, well, you know, so I think you can convince yourself as long as they have good conformation and balance, who cares about breed characteristics? But Dr. Lawrence's presentation here really zoned in on the importance of breed characteristics and why all that is important. So you need to study that along with all the other good information it has in there. Dr. Lawrence, I don't know if you're watching the chat box, but we've got comments saying that was neat, and thank you for giving us reasons for evaluating horse conformation really helps.
Okay.
And I think one of, like, obviously, like Dr. Lawrence said in the beginning, that nobody's perfect, no horse is perfect, no person is perfect. And obviously the little mare that she shows is not pretty either, or has good conformation, but she may be very sweet, okay? And she may be able to cart around a 60-pound child up until the point that that child wants to compete and become a Grand Prix jumper. At that point, that she's not going to take him there, right? But she may be the one. So I like what she was saying, that depending on the discipline that everybody wants to do, each conformation is going to be, you know, acceptable or better than another one to achieve higher goals. And I feel bad for the little mare because she's really, really not cute. But a lot of the times I feel that I look at a horse like, I don't even know. And then I can break it down somehow. But I feel that sometimes we had Noah Carter, Janet, was somebody that would come and say, and he would win 50, 50, 50, 50 on every judging. But the time to give reasons, he's just like, I can't put it into words because he's just like, my heart tells me this, right? Which, as a buyer, if you can put that into, you know, in a correct purchase, it's a good skill to have, to be able to have that eye to say that horse has something good about it, or that horse doesn't have something good about it.
Yeah, I mean, I use it a lot. I do a lot of, I cross a lot of breeds. And so one of the things, when I look at static balance, I try to say, okay, I'm going to go look at the best saddlebreds in the universe and see what their balance is. And then I'm going to go look at the best reining horses in the universe, and I'm going to look at what their balance is. Because that really, those are your models. You want to look at the best ones and say, what about it that makes them good? What is the structure that most of them have? And then the other thing to think about is that when you have horses that have some kind of structural problem, particularly ones that relate to their ability to distribute forces, you want to think about, is that really important for their job? So if they're not really galloping and jumping, it might not be a big deal. And then the second thing is, do they have balance issues that are going to either compensate? So let's say that you've got a horse and he's got crooked knees. Well, if he's got a big hind quarter and not a big shoulder, and he's kind of a light framed horse, he's not going to land as heavy on his front legs as a horse that has a big, heavily muscled shoulder and a low set neck that's downhill. So same conformation defects could have drastically different implications for the horse that you're actually going to buy. So those are some things to sort of think about, you know, in real life when you're going out and looking for that. So
You know, Dr. Camargo brought in a good point too, is knowing the why behind some of this stuff, I think will help you kids. You've seen, well, I think all of you all are seniors, but the seniors that are doing horse judging and giving reasons, I think this will give you more power in your reasons to think through some of your decisions and also to talk about those, you know, in your reasons.
Yeah, so for instance, the front leg conformation, you know, something that you could put together in a reason would be to say, however, number 2 was toed out, and when she moved, she tended to wing in and almost interfere. So you can kind of put those two things together, the characteristic of the front limb conformation and then the way the horse moved. And certainly, or you could say, when the mare stood still, she appeared to be slightly toed out. But when I watched her move, she had very straight movement. So I didn't consider the toeing out to be as important for her as perhaps another horse. So you can kind of hook those things together, and that shows the reason listener that you're able to connect the points. And likewise, you know, the horse was straighter in its shoulder, and when it jogged, it had a shorter stride or something like that. Especially, you know, if you're judging hunters, if you're doing a class of hunters, you know, having a long stride and a low knee, low foot movement, that's pretty important. And so if you can connect, again, those conformation characteristics that tells you, okay, I see that this horse is pretty straight in his shoulder. I need to make sure that I watch him move to see how he actually moves.
Dr. Lawrence, after I watched this presentation that you gave years ago, I've been paying attention a lot about the pastern length, not just the angle, but the length. And a lot of hunters, I feel sometimes I've seen them with long, I don't know if they're just longer animals or everything became long on them, but they look sometimes weak on, like almost like the pastern is too long to be able to like flow in an appropriate way. So that's something that I have started to notice more, and maybe because the horses that we have around here are a lot of thoroughbreds that didn't make, they were not suitable for racing, or they were just slow, or because of that. So I think that that's what we see a lot these days because of, you know, people adopting thoroughbreds. But that's something that I've been noticing a lot in these horses, which again may be fine for them because they're like low level, showing locally. But it's something that,
those are good things to look at. I mean, we didn't talk about feet, but those are also important to look at.